There's a rhythm to history that few notice, yet it repeats with terrifying precision. Over the last 250 years, three nations, France, Russia, and Cuba, followed a path that led from stability to chaos, stage by stage, grievance by grievance. And today, in 2025, the United States is tracing that same trajectory. It is as if history wrote a script in blood and upheaval, and we are reading it line by line. France was not a backward state. It was the crown jewel of Europe. Paris, the beating heart of culture, philosophy, and science, radiated sophistication. The language of diplomacy was French. The salons of thinkers shaped the ideas that would ripple across the globe. King Louis XVI presided over a monarchy that had ruled for 8 centuries. To the outside world, the kingdom seemed eternal, untouchable. And yet, within 5 years, the monarchy was decapitated, literally, and the nation was swept into the reign of terror, where tens of thousands were executed for perceived political crimes. Fast forward to 1917. Russia, an empire spanning 11 time zones and home to 180 million souls, was a behemoth on paper. Yet, within 8 months, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II, bound by divine right yet blind to reality, was executed. A revolutionary wave swept the country, and in the chaos that followed, 20 million would perish in civil war, famine, and purges. Then 1959. Cuba, a Caribbean paradise, was prosperous, modern, and vibrant. American tourists flooded Havana, casinos thrived, and the streets buzzed with life. Within 2 years, Fidel Castro dismantled the Batista regime, nationalized the economy, and imposed a dictatorship that would last 6 decades. 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, 3 governments that seemed secure yet crumbled into chaos. And each time, the elites were blindsided. They thought their power was permanent. They believed the masses would never rise. They were catastrophically wrong. Now, in the United States, every warning sign that preceded these upheavals is glaringly present: extreme wealth inequality, institutional corruption, public distrust, and simmering anger beneath the surface. We are not merely approaching the pattern, we are squarely in stage 4. And history warns, stages 5 and 6 arrive swiftly. But before we dive into the stages, we must ask, what truly is a revolution? It is not a protest, it is not a riot, it is not mere political change. A revolution is a systemic rupture, when the entire social order collapses and is replaced by a new regime, often more oppressive than the one it toppled dead. Revolutions do not emerge from poverty alone. Poverty has existed in every society throughout human history. Revolutions erupt when expectations collide with reality, when people believe they deserve more than they receive. They occur when the gap between elites and the general population becomes so vast that the social contract fractures irreparably. And they become inevitable when the populace loses faith in the ability of institutions, government, courts, elections, to deliver justice or reform. As John F. Kennedy warned, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. History proves him right, repeatedly. France, Russia, Cuba. Different continents, different centuries, different ideologies, but the 6-stage sequence remains consistent. Understanding this sequence is not academic, it is predictive. It allows us to see where a society stands and how close it may be to unraveling entirely. Let's begin with the revolution that set the template for modern upheaval, France, 1789. By the late 1780s, France was the pinnacle of European civilization. Paris, the city of light, pulsed with creativity, commerce, and political thought. Yet beneath the glittering salons and sumptuous palaces lay systemic rot. This is stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. France had 27 million people, divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, owned 10% of land and paid no taxes. The second estate, the nobility, owned 25% and also paid almost nothing. The third estate, 26 million peasants, laborers, and bourgeoisie, bore the full tax burden while owning 65% of the land. In other words, 1.5% of the population paid nothing, while 98.5% carried the weight of the state. And inequality went far beyond taxes. Nobles could hunt on peasant land, demand forced labor, and live in palaces while their neighbors starved. By 1788, a catastrophic harvest had doubled the price of bread, the staple of the peasant diet, consuming 88% of their income. Meanwhile, Versailles continued to host lavish feasts and balls. The gap between elite indulgence and popular suffering was not only material, it was existential, a moral chasm. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Louis XVI was not cruel, he was paralyzed by indecision. France was bankrupt, a legacy of extravagant wars, including the costly support of the American Revolution. Louis's solution? Borrow more, raise taxes on the already burdened Third Estate, and cut nothing from his luxurious court. The nobility and clergy blocked reforms, refusing to sacrifice privilege for national survival. The state teetered on collapse, and the monarchy's apparent stability was a veneer over systemic decay. By 1789, France faced simultaneous crises: a bankrupt treasury, unaffordable food, and a citizenry that had lost faith in governance. Louis convened the Estates General, a representative assembly dormant for 175 years, intending to legitimize new taxes. Instead, it became the spark for revolution. Stage 3. Middle-class radicalization. The Third Estate, comprising peasants, artisans, merchants, and educated professionals, demanded equitable representation, one vote per person, not per estate, which maintained a 2-to-1 aristocratic advantage. Louis refused. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, locking themselves in a tennis court and vowing not to disperse until France had a constitution. Here, the educated middle class, the very people who should have upheld the system, rejected it. When lawyers and merchants declare the government illegitimate, revolution is no longer theoretical. It is inevitable. Just weeks later, Parisians stormed the Bastille on July 14th, killing guards and parading heads on pikes. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, the courts all lost legitimacy. The National Assembly abolished feudalism and declared the rights of man, but it wasn't enough. Radicals demanded blood. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, called for extreme measures: execute the king, redistribute wealth, purge enemies. The economy remained in crisis. Hunger, fear, and rage propelled the masses to embrace extremism. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Louis XVI was executed on January 21, 1793, followed by Marie Antoinette in October. The Reign of Terror began, claiming 40,000 lives in a year. Moderates fell, revolution devoured its children, and eventually Napoleon seized power. The promise of liberty had descended into authoritarianism and continental war. The lesson is stark. Inequality plus incompetence plus institutional collapse equals revolution, and chaos often yields a more ruthless regime than the one toppled. 128 years after the French Revolution, the world witnessed another seismic collapse: Russia, 1917. Unlike France, Russia was not just wealthy elites on the edge of collapse. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire spanning Europe and Asia, home to 180 million people, yet run by a dynasty blind to its own fragility. The Romanovs had ruled for over 3 centuries. To outsiders, the empire seemed unshakable. But underneath, the same rot that destroyed France was thriving: extreme inequality, governmental incompetence, and growing disillusionment. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Russia's hierarchy was brutally rigid. The Tsar and nobility owned nearly all land and resources. Peasants, 80% of the population, had been nominally freed from serfdom in 1861. But the terms were brutal. They paid rents they could never fully satisfy, lived on tiny plots, and remained economically shackled. Urban factory workers faced 12 to 14-hour days, starvation wages, and unsafe conditions. Child labor was routine. Meanwhile, the aristocracy hosted opulent balls and hunted game across vast estates. The contrast was medieval in extremity, an empire modern on paper, but feudal in practice. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Nicholas II was a man convinced of divine right but blind to reality. Reform was anathema. In 1905, workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace demanding fair treatment. The Imperial Guard opened fire. Hundreds died on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Trust in the monarchy fractured irreparably. Then came World War I, a catastrophe. Russia mobilized millions of soldiers, often poorly armed, poorly trained, and poorly fed. Entire regiments surrendered without bullets. Supply lines collapsed. Officers made fatal errors, while Nicholas remained insulated in his palaces, guided by a nation not backward, not starving, not a feudal wasteland. Havana sparkled with neon lights, casinos hummed with activity, and American tourists flocked to the Caribbean paradise. Economically and culturally, Cuba was vibrant, a shining example of modernity in Latin America, and yet, beneath the glamour, the same forces that toppled France and Russia were quietly assembling. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Wealth and opportunity were concentrated among Havana elites, closely tied to President Fulgencio Batista's regime. Rural areas, especially in the east, were impoverished. Sugar plantations dominated the economy, and American companies extracted profits, sending wealth abroad or into the pockets of a tiny domestic elite. Most Cubans, peasants, laborers, and urban workers, lacked access to basic health care, education, or opportunity. The chasm between Havana's nightclubs and the impoverished countryside was stark, moral, and politically combustible. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Batista seized power in a 1952 coup, canceling elections and ruling by decree. Corruption was systemic, police were bribed, courts were rigged, and political opponents disappeared. The government existed not to serve the nation, but to enrich its rulers and cronies. American mobsters ran Havana's casinos with Batista's blessing, paying him kickbacks and leaving ordinary Cubans to fend for themselves. Brutality was routine. Protests were met with police beatings, arrests, torture, and executions. In other words, the state was not failing. It was actively oppressing its people. Stage 3. Middle-class radicalization. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer from a relatively well-off family, could have joined the elite. Instead, he saw injustice and chose rebellion. His first attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953 failed, landing him in prison. Yet his trial became a stage for revolutionary rhetoric. "History will absolve me," he declared, capturing the imagination of thousands. Released in 1955, Castro went to Mexico to plan the next move. December 1956, he returned on the yacht Granma with 82 men, landing in eastern Cuba. Ambushed by Batista's forces, only 20 survived, retreating into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Where most would have surrendered, Castro persisted. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Batista's brutality, combined with systemic corruption, turned the population against the government. Army reprisals, village burnings, and police torture only fueled recruitment for the rebels. Institutions that should have maintained order, the police, courts, and even foreign backers like the U.S., began to crumble. When your foreign patron abandons you, the regime is effectively finished. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. By 1958, Castro commanded thousands of fighters, organized urban resistance cells, and enjoyed support from peasants who saw him as a defender rather than a conqueror. Batista's army collapsed under desertion and corruption. Soldiers fled with stolen funds. Officers abandoned posts. January 1, 1959, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic with $300 million. January 8, Castro entered Havana victorious. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Initial promises of democracy, free press, and elections evaporated. Within months, the regime hardened into dictatorship. Political opponents were arrested or executed, press freedom was quashed, and property was nationalized. Hundreds were executed in the first year. Thousands fled. The educated middle class that had once supported Castro realized too late that revolutions often trade one oppressor for another. The Cuba of liberty and opportunity was replaced by decades of authoritarian control. The Cuban example is critical. Even a relatively modern, prosperous nation is vulnerable when corruption, inequality, and institutional failure align. Unlike France or Russia, the seeds of revolution in Cuba did not spring from mass starvation, yet the cycle remained identical. Extremists who seize power rarely fulfill promises. They destroy, consolidate power, and replace one form of tyranny with another. Pattern across 3 centuries. France, 1789. Russia, 1917. Cuba, 1959. Different continents, different societies, different ideologies, yet the sequence is the same. Extreme wealth inequality, when the top 1 to 2% control vast resources while the majority struggles. Resentment becomes political fuel. Government corruption and incompetence. When the state serves elites rather than the populace, legitimacy erodes. Middle-class radicalization. Revolutions ignite not with the poorest, but when educated professionals, merchants, and intellectuals abandon the system. Loss of faith in institutions, elections, courts, and police lose credibility, social cohesion fractures. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. Organized groups offer alternatives, exploiting institutional collapse and public rage. Government overthrown. Chaos ensues, and extremists consolidate power, often delivering outcomes far worse than the regime they replaced. The pattern repeats with mathematical precision. Extremes arise, moderates are sidelined, and the promised utopia often collapses into blood, terror, and authoritarianism. Now, consider the United States in 2025. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The top 1% now control over 32% of national wealth, higher than France in 1789. The top 0.1% owns more than the bottom 90% combined. Visible wealth, private jets, mega yachts, space tourism stands in stark contrast to millions struggling to afford housing, healthcare, and education. The anger is justified, and it is accumulating like dry kindling. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Congressional approval hovers at 15%. Supreme Court legitimacy is questioned. Insider trading by legislators, lobbyist-driven policy, and partisan gridlock reinforce the perception that government serves elites, not the public. Infrastructure crumbles. National debt eclipses $36 trillion. Faith in democracy erodes when citizens believe the system is rigged. Stage 3. Middle class hollowed and radicalized. College debt, unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, and rising living costs leave young professionals disillusioned. Engineers, teachers, and healthcare workers struggle to maintain the standard of living of their parents. Educated citizens, who should anchor stability, begin questioning the system itself. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Trust in media, law enforcement, and elections is fractured. Half the population believes elections are rigged, the other half believes violent threats to the state are justified. Shared institutions are no longer seen as legitimate. The society effectively exists as two nations in one, waiting for a spark. Any event, a contested election, economic crash, or viral incident, could ignite unrest. We are in Stage 4. History tells us that Stage 5, the revolutionary movement gaining mass support, will accelerate faster than most anticipate. Extremist ideologies, both left and right, are gaining traction. Socialist redistribution rhetoric grows on one side. Authoritarian strongman sentiment rises on the other. Both claim the system is irredeemable. Stage 6, the overthrow of government, is not inevitable, but history warns it is plausible. In past revolutions, chaos brought mass death, economic collapse, and authoritarian replacement. Supply chains fail, states fracture, violence escalates, external powers exploit domestic weakness. The familiar order collapses, yes, leaving a vacuum filled by the ruthless. America has never experienced this level of simultaneous inequality, corruption, and institutional breakdown. But neither had France, Russia, or Cuba. Exceptionalism does not protect against the mathematics of revolution. Once the social contract breaks, the consequences unfold quickly, and moderates are swept aside. We arrive at the precipice. In 2025, the United States sits squarely in Stage 4, the loss of faith in institutions. Trust in courts, law enforcement, elections, and even the media has collapsed. Half the country believes the system is rigged, the other half believes that any challenge to authority is a threat to democracy itself. The threads that hold society together are fraying, and history whispers a warning. Stage 5, where revolutionary movements gain mass support, is the natural consequence of this fracture. Stage 5 emerges not spontaneously. It is a convergence of extremism and desperation. Look back at France. The Jacobins promised justice for the oppressed, execution for enemies, and redistribution of wealth. In Russia, the Bolsheviks offered peace to land and bread. In Cuba, Castro's forces promised liberation from brutality and corruption. People rallied, not because they loved these leaders, but because they hated the alternative. When moderate solutions fail, extremism prospers. In America, the pieces are assembling. On the left, calls for wealth redistribution and systemic overhaul grow louder, fueled by frustration over astronomical inequality. On the right, authoritarian narratives promise order amid perceived chaos, exploiting fear of collapse. Both sides increasingly perceive the system as broken beyond repair. Social media amplifies these voices, accelerating polarization and radicalization. History shows us when the moderates lose influence, the extremes step forward, and Stage 5 arrives. Stage 6, the culmination, is far more terrifying. In France, 40,000 were executed in the Reign of Terror. In Russia, civil war claimed 10 million lives. In Cuba, an authoritarian regime endured for 6 decades. What would Stage 6 look like in the United States? We can only infer from patterns. Political violence could escalate beyond riots to organized insurgencies, assassinations, and territorial defiance. Military and police units might fracture along ideological lines. Supply chains could collapse, leading to shortages of food, medicine, and energy. Economic paralysis would follow, as trust in any system evaporates. States could resist federal authority. Foreign powers would exploit the chaos. The stakes are philosophical as well as practical. Revolutions are rarely about abstract ideologies. They are the result of broken social contracts. The lessons of France, Russia, and Cuba are clear. Revolutions do not deliver the utopias they promise. They replace one extreme with another, often worse. Moderates, the reformers, the diplomats, the pragmatic citizens, are sidelined or eliminated. Extremists thrive on destruction, not construction. And those who believe revolution will bring freedom often discover, too late, that chaos is far more lethal than corruption. Yet this is not inevitability. Recognition of the pattern allows intervention. Stage 4 is a warning, the last point at which meaningful reform can prevent escalation. Inequality can be addressed, institutions restored, and social cohesion reinforced. Policy, trust building, and structural reform are urgent. History demonstrates the cost of ignoring the warning signs. France, Russia, and Cuba all thought they were exceptional. They were wrong. The United States is no different in this respect. Exceptionalism does not immunize a society against the mathematical forces of revolution. Consider the human element. Every revolution is also a story of expectation betrayed. People believe in fairness, opportunity, and justice. When the elites appear untouchable, when the wealthy flaunt inequality, when governments fail to address grievances, faith collapses. And once faith collapses, the cycle accelerates, often faster than society can comprehend. Revolutions are emotional as much as they are structural. They feed on fear, anger, and the sense of betrayal. We can see this pattern reflected today. Wealth gaps wider than the Gilded Age, political gridlock preventing solutions, a hollowed-out middle class, and media ecosystems amplifying mistrust. We are living in a society where Stage 4 is not theoretical, it is real. The spark could be economic, political, or cultural, but the tinder is dry. Stage 5, where mass support consolidates around alternative movements, is not inevitable, but the probability grows each day. Trust in institutions continues to decline. Stage 6, the final unraveling, serves as both warning and prophecy. Chaos, violence, and authoritarian resurgence have been the endgame across centuries and continents. Yet in the shadow of history there is agency. The pattern is a guide, not a fate. Understanding it allows societies to intervene before the extremes consolidate power. Reform must be strategic, comprehensive, and inclusive. Inequality must be addressed not just in economics, but in perception and opportunity. Corruption must be rooted out, competence restored, and institutions revitalized. Education, civic engagement, and trust building are the foundation of resilience. History is brutal in its lessons. France, Russia, Cuba, 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, 3 sets of elites who believe themselves untouchable, each proven catastrophically wrong. The United States has never been through this cycle, but it now occupies a stage all previous societies could have recognized in hindsight. Stage 4 is a warning. The steps to Stage 5 and 6, once initiated, accelerate faster than society anticipates, and when they arrive, moderation, debate, and reason often vanish under the weight of fear, anger, and ideological fervor. The question facing America today is not theoretical. Will it intervene in time? Can inequality, corruption, and institutional decay be meaningfully addressed before social cohesion breaks irreparably? Or will history's pattern repeat once more, indifferent to wealth, democracy, or claims of exceptionalism? We are at a crossroads, a rare historical moment where foresight can still avert catastrophe. Understanding the mechanics of revolution, the six-stage cycle that toppled kingdoms, empires, and republics, is not an academic exercise. It is survival. The warnings are clear, the historical precedent is undeniable, and the stakes are unprecedented in modern American history. The past has written the template. The future is being decided in real time. Every act of reform, every restoration of trust, every reduction in inequality buys time, but the clock is ticking. History is patient, but the consequences of ignoring its lessons are unforgiving. Across 3 centuries, across continents and cultures, one pattern emerges with chilling consistency. Revolutions are not random. They follow a predictable trajectory, 6 stages that transform stable societies into chaos and often into regimes far harsher than those they replaced. France, 1789. Russia 1917, Cuba 1959. Each time, elites believed themselves immune, institutions appeared unshakable, and the system seemed permanent. Each time, the cycle consumed what they once controlled. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The elite flourish while the masses struggle. Visibility matters. In all cases, the contrast between opulence and deprivation was not merely economic, it was moral, political, and psychologically explosive. When the public can see what they are denied, the social contract begins to fray. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Power ceases to serve the governed. Leaders mismanage resources, ignore crises, and prioritize their own privilege. In France, Louis XVI borrowed recklessly while peasants starved. In Russia, Nicholas II sent millions to die in a war he barely understood. In Cuba, Batista ruled for profit and oppression. Corruption and incompetence alone do not spark revolution, but they prime the environment. Stage 3. Middle-class radicalization. Revolutions ignite not with the destitute, but when those who are educated and capable lose hope in the system. Lawyers, merchants, students, urban professionals, those who should anchor stability, turn against the state. When the system can no longer meet their expectations, they seek alternatives. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Elections, courts, police, media all lose legitimacy. Society fragments, trust evaporates. The people no longer believe the system can deliver justice, fairness, or order. This is the point of no return, the stage America currently occupies. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. Extremists exploit institutional collapse. They promise justice, equity, peace, or order, but always through radical change. The masses rally, not necessarily out of devotion, but out of desperation and rage. History demonstrates that once moderate voices are marginalized, organized extremism dominates. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos erupts. The old order is dismantled violently. The promised utopia rarely appears. Instead, blood, terror, famine, and authoritarianism follow. France's guillotine, Russia's civil war, Cuba's dictatorship all illustrate that revolution often substitutes one tyranny for another. America, in 2025, stands at the precipice. Stage 1 is evident in wealth gaps unprecedented in U.S. history. Stage 2 manifests in political dysfunction, institutional distrust, and systemic corruption. Stage 3 is emerging as an educated, frustrated middle class grows radicalized. Stage 4 is here, visible in polarized elections, public distrust, and media fragmentation. Stage 5 has not yet fully erupted, but ideological extremism is gaining traction. Stage 6 remains hypothetical, but history offers a blueprint for what could follow if the cycle continues unchecked. The philosophical lesson is stark. Revolutions are as much emotional as structural. They exploit fear, anger, and betrayal. They are mathematical in their inevitability when societal conditions reach critical thresholds. Yet history is also prescriptive. Understanding the pattern allows intervention. Stage 4, while perilous, is a point of opportunity where reform, accountability, and restoration of trust can prevent escalation. Netflix-style reflection. History is not merely a series of dates and events. It is a mirror, revealing the consequences of human behavior when inequality, corruption, and institutional decay collide. France, Russia, Cuba, they were societies with identities, pride, and potential. Yet they fell because the combination of greed, incompetence, and lost trust created a pressure cooker. The same forces simmer today. The United States, like the nations before it, must confront its own contradictions. Can extreme wealth be tempered, corruption curtailed, and institutions strengthened before the spark ignites? Can the social contract be restored before mass disillusionment becomes a tidal wave? History does not offer guarantees, but it offers lessons. Painful, clear, and repeatable. The past has already written the answer to the present. Cinematic conclusion: the six-stage cycle is a story written in blood, ambition, and betrayal. Revolutions are not distant events in history. They are patterns of human society, emerging wherever inequality, incompetence, and lost faith coincide. America sits at stage 4. The clock is ticking. What happens next is not inevitable, but it will be decisive. The decisions made today, the trust rebuilt or further eroded, the inequalities addressed or ignored, will determine whether history repeats itself or is redirected. The warning is timeless. Extremes rise, moderates falter, institutions fail, and when the pressure becomes unbearable, the explosion is swift and merciless. Yet awareness is the first defense. Understanding the cycle, the 6 stages that toppled kingdoms, empires, and republics, allows us to act before the fire spreads. History is patient, but it is relentless, and for those who ignore the lessons, it is unforgiving.